Welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. We're excited to bring you season 3 of new episodes featuring in-depth content across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. We've had some extraordinary guests on our channel, including Formula One's Claire Williams.
I'm a firm believer that any great team, any successful team has a great culture flowing through it. You aren't successful if you don't. So we put a lot of work into this.
Renowned mountaineer Kenton Cool.
There, 2019 there with a client, a big storm came in and literally destroyed Camp 2. And I got some video footage of Sherpas like trying to hold on to the tent fabric as it blows away. And
the Royal Navy's Commodore Steve Morehouse, commander of the UK Carrier Strike Group.
The squadron of F-35 aircraft we have on board is a Royal Air Force squadron, and the personnel on there are drawn from both the Navy and the Air Force. So, what better way of showing just the efficiency and the joined-up nature that we now have.
And distinguished Sky News anchor Jeremy Thompson.
We had 2 little vans with satellite links, and we leapfrogged up the road to Pristina, the capital, throughout that first day, with non-stop coverage from basically inside a war zone.
We also sit down with the likes of TikTok, Twitch and Twitter and continue to bring you conversations around business and trade, leadership and people, sustainability, sports and arts and much, much more. Thank you, as always, for your support and we hope you enjoy this podcast.
Okay, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore podcast channel. My name is Simon Middlebrough. I'm the Chief Executive of SAISL here in Singapore, and I'm also the Chair of the Transport, Logistics and Supply Chain Committee within the Chamber in Singapore. Our Chamber covers, and our committee covers a wide variety of Tier 1 and SME players across maritime, shipping, aviation and aerospace, logistics, legal and technology spaces. So we're a very broad membership, and we are involved in a very broad set of activities, both within our committee, but also wrestling with some of the world's bigger challenges across regulation and sustainability in many other sectors. Today's conversation is going to focus on the aviation and aerospace segments, and clearly an industry that has been through a very significant, challenging time through COVID, but now as we start to see the seeds of recovery, this introductory podcast will talk through some of the challenges that the industry sees as it returns to growth, and what are the business model, the dynamics, the customer, and some of the technology and sustainability challenges that we will have to face in the coming years. This will set up a further set of discussions that our committee will be leading and delivering as we go into 2022. And I hope that if this piques your interest, you will look out for further activities next year. I'm joined today by 2 fellow speakers, Paul Burton, Managing Director of Aviation Week, and James Jordan from HFW. And together, the 3 of us will take you through the rest of this podcast. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now to lead us into the conversation. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak on this BritCham podcast. So as Simon has alluded to, what we wanted to do today was provide you with an overview of the industry from a number of different vantage points. I considered banning the word COVID today because I think everyone within the sector is rather fed up with looking back and kind of wringing their hands about what's happened, etc. What we want to do is really frame a narrative for the future of the industry from the perspective of industry within Singapore, but also broadening out to some global trends, particularly around the criticality of sustainability in the aviation sector and how a number of different companies and OEMs are striving to take a lead in that area, and also around how new technologies are impacting digitization of supply chain, for example. It's actually a very exciting time for the aviation and aerospace sector, and we wanted really to focus on some of those critical developments that you may not have heard of in the mainstream press. I wanted to preface today's podcast just with some observations from the Aviation Week Network annual forecast, which was released 2 months ago and is a 10-year time frame. And just to draw out some kind of key points here, both from the Asia Pacific vantage point, but also on a global level. And naturally, the economic impact of the unmentionable pandemic has been severe on the aviation sector, and new variants popping up every week, it seems. So just when we think we're kind of moving back towards a semblance of normality, it feels like we're broadsided once again. But I think there is resilience now, where there wasn't 18 months ago, in that airlines are pivoting in a more agile way to accommodate kind of customer needs. I think, you know, the major kind of desire from passengers is that they can fly safely, and from governments that they are satisfying their own internal legislative requirements that testing occurs at certain intervals. You know, the kind of lexicon around PCR tests, etc., is now seeping into the consciousness, I think, of the passenger community. So I just want to draw out some metrics. The slides that I'm talking to, I hope will be available to all listeners to download, just to give you a graphical depiction of what I'm saying. One of the key metrics that we track on a monthly basis is around flight hour utilization for commercial aircraft fleets, and kind of using pre-COVID levels from September 19 as zero, if you like. We've seen consistently over the previous 6 months utilization in China go above that 0 point. But also in China, it's interesting in that, as I'm sure you're aware, whenever there's a peak in a particular city, the whole country or that city will shut down. And the government mandated before Chinese New Year this year that flights should not be taken. And therefore we dropped rapidly. In December 2020, Chinese utilization was above the 0 point, was actually higher than September 2019. It fell drastically within February, but back by March, April, May, it was above those pre-COVID levels. So China's an interesting bellwether, I think, for how many flight hours passengers will take. If you look at the graph, North America has gradually risen back up from a low point of about 30% utilization in April 2020, back up now to around 90% of where it was. So we're seeing the recovery strengthening in North America. It's unlikely that the Omicron variant will have a significant impact upon that. It's really in Asia Pacific where levels have remained low point 20%, rose to about 50% in December last year, but back now moving down towards 30% of that total utilization. So it's in this region where we sit that the industry needs to figure out how to kickstart that kind of confidence within the travel capability once again. We also track in-service active aircraft, which is obviously a key metric. Again, unsurprisingly, after the Wuhan lockdown and the New York lockdown in January and March 2020, the lowest number of in-service fleets was around 21,000 aircraft. This was from a peak of just under 30,000 in December 2019. So we saw a significant drop. That's risen gradually again over the months. And as of September, we were at around, say, 27,000 in-service fleet, some of which were parked or in reserve. But the number of parked aircraft is dropping quite notably as well. So that's a key indicator that shows we're moving back gradually month by month towards the peak in-service fleet levels that we saw around September 2019. Deliveries is another key metric, and peak deliveries occurred around 2018. We saw about 1,800 aircraft delivered in that year. That dropped precipitously to about 800 in 2020. our forecast shows that we will reach those 2018 levels again by 2024. So, you're seeing a significant impact on the delivery tempo and cycle of new deliveries within commercial aviation. We forecast around 20,000 worldwide deliveries over a 10-year period to 2031. Narrow bodies are really driving those recovery efforts, with around 77% of deliveries coming in the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737 families. Everyone asks us about the status of the Boeing MAX, unsurprisingly. The delivery status since the grounding is as follows: 143 delivered out of 447 built, with 304 awaiting final delivery. So you can see there's still a significant impact, and that's enabled Airbus to really drive ahead in terms of that narrow body recovery. The final metric I will talk about in today's podcast before handing over for discussion is around retirements. And retirements is, again, another critical metric looking at the health of the industry. In 2019, we saw about 680 retirements. And between 2015 and 2021, about 2% of the fleet was retired. Moving forward over the next decade, we're seeing around 1,000 retirements a year, which is coming up for 3% of the fleet. Contrary to impressions, however, 2019 and 2020 were not record years for retirements. There's a historic high percentage of fleet rates dominating the second half of the decade. What this will mean, though, which plays directly into Simon's portfolio, is that the used spare parts and what we call green time engines may start to flood the market for popular legacy types, which will depress pricing. So if we see around 10,000 retirements over the next decade, that's significantly up over the previous periods. So it all has a knock-on impact upon the spare parts available for repair and sustainment activities. So again, I'd be pleased to share our forecasts with listeners after we've recorded. But for now, that's all I'll talk about. I would be delighted to get views on that market forecast and overall impressions from James and Simon before we come to look more significantly at their views on MRO, on equipment suppliers, on regulatory and commercial. So guys, over to you. How are you feeling as we currently stand about the market?
Thanks, Paul. It's Simon again. So yeah, I think we are definitely starting to see the recovery pick up a little bit of pace. I play in the large wide body long haul market predominantly, and clearly that was most significantly affected. But even there, the effects were very uneven around the networks. Certainly in the aftermarket, the different OEMs have different strategies on where they place their loads. And while some activity is driven purely by utilization of flying hours, there's also lots of other activity that's more driven by the product. So depending on where you were in the world, some people were extremely impacted to the tune of almost having to mothball capacity and capability for 18 months, all the way through to the other end of the spectrum, which is probably where I landed, where I had to manage a severe 18-month dip, but it was manageable in the sense of retaining core workforce and then making sure that we're ready to kick on now the loads come back. So again, using your 0 point as a baseline, I am now effectively back to the same level of activity that I was pre-COVID. So it's been a sort of 20-month dip. And the forecast going forward, ultimately, I think, return us to where we were aiming before, but clearly 2 to 3 years later.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Simon. I think those figures are really interesting. And from my perspective, I'm certainly seeing Clients are becoming busier, they're starting to resume normal operations, and they are starting to look at legal projects which will prepare them for the future. In 2019, the beginning of 2019, a lot of my airline and aviation clients were looking at projects to expand their businesses. And when COVID-19 really took hold, all of those projects were cancelled. But I'm now seeing more optimism, a reinvestment in the business, and looking towards the future as to how they can create new products to enhance passenger demand and bring passengers back and restore passenger confidence. So I think there is reason to be optimistic. I think there's still many challenges ahead. And with a return to normality, what we're seeing, again, from a legal perspective, is that businesses are starting to normalize their legal and commercial relationships again. Again, what happened during the pandemic, and I think this has been widely publicized, is that actually the aviation industry did come together. Businesses tried to figure out how they could make contracts work by entering into new agreements or deferring payments, and really seeing what could be done to ensure that the industry made it through the initial phases of the pandemic. As you said, we've now developed a level of resilience, and some of those parties are going to want to go back to normal. And what we're seeing, especially on the leasing side of the business, is that there is now a desire especially from lessors, to return to the pre-pandemic days in terms of payment terms and ensuring that airlines fulfill their contractual obligations. So looking ahead, there could be a little bit of litigation and a little bit of tension on that front. And I think we'll see that across the industry. So that's something to be wary of. Hopefully, businesses are able to, again, work together to figure out ways that they can mitigate the need for litigation, because that really should be a nuclear option. And I think as well, again, something that I look at quite a lot and have handled many of in my career is accidents and incidents, and managing the fallout from those issues. You mentioned the number of aircraft which had been essentially mothballed during the pandemic, and now we're seeing a kind of return to service of some of those aircraft which may not have been used for several months or upwards, maybe over the last year. I think what we see from most operators is that there's been absolutely no issues. The aircraft have been maintained. They've had all of the regulatory checks performed on the aircraft, and there really is nothing to be worried about. And I really don't want to, cause any fear for the traveling public that might be listening to this podcast. However, in certain jurisdictions, we are aware that there have been incidents of aircraft cannibalization, potentially aircraft which have not been maintained properly and have not had the relevant checks done. And so that is going to be, again, something which we need to consider as an industry as we move out the pandemic. So I think while, there's a lot of cause to be hopeful, and I do think that 2022 and 2023 are going to be really positive years for aviation, there are going to be some speed bumps along the way. And I think we all need to be mindful of that and try and anticipate them before they cause too much of a shock.
Thanks, James. That's a really helpful summary. And I think you've both alluded to the fact that there can often be a schism between the desired pace of return to normality and the realities on the ground in terms of the varying capacities of operators to deliver, to put aircraft back into service perhaps too soon. From the lessor's perspective, that desire to get return to the more normal commercial agreements that the airlines themselves may not be in a position to sign and actually realise. So there may be tension there as they start to look to cash in a way that they haven't been able to in the past 18 months. So I think we'll see that recovery continue to be uneven, and I suspect in many cases it will simply flow with the number of kind of passenger kilometres that are flown, and B, the overall economic state of each country. I mentioned a number of the emerging markets where the pace of vaccine is way down. That's going to flow into the recovery of the sector, I'm sure. I'm wondering now if we can dive a little more deeply into your respective areas. So Simon, I wonder if you could just give us some more thoughts around the OEM MRO sector, maybe looking around you at Lita, but more broadly some trends that you're kind of seeing, perhaps alluding to how your business model or the business models of some of your competitors are having to shift to accommodate the new normal.
Yeah, sure. So if I start with the OEM side, as you said in your opening remarks, Paul, I think the demand signal and the production rates that Airbus and Boeing are going after in the narrow body, is pretty racy. Airbus in particular have, signaled to their supply chain that build rates will be, well above pre-COVID levels in the narrow bodies going forward. And given that the supply chain generally cuts across most sectors and therefore is quite a big hit through COVID, I think there is a certain nervousness about the ability for the underlying component supply chains to recover in line with that rate. Bit of a different story in wide body, clearly very much down, and I think will probably continue to be that way for the next 5 years or so. Airbus mainly concentrating on A350s, Boeing clearly with 787 recoveries, and then trying to bring the 777X into the market in the next few years. Lots of value in those airframes, but volumetrically clearly much smaller. So I think that's the OEM position. I think that has flowed down a lot of challenge into the supply chain. We've seen a lot of consolidation and closure and downsizing all the way through the supply chains, whether it's through the engine side, airframes, composites, and the underlying supply chains. I think the industry as a whole has lost, in many cases, up to 15-20% of the jobs have come out of those sectors. We are starting to see people rehiring. So maybe there's an implication there that some of the initial cuts were too deep. But recovering that capacity and retaining the capability, I think, will be challenging. And away from the operational side, clearly that means that, again, there are some risks and opportunities, if you like, in the commercial space. This happened on a similar sort of shape after 9/11. And we saw some significant reordering of the strategic supply chains underneath the OEMs, who saw opportunities to go and grab some market share. And I'm sure we will see similar incidences of that as we go forward. And therefore, the supply chains in 2 or 3 years might have different players or certainly different centres of gravities from what we've seen today. On the MRO side, again, it depends on where you're sitting in the segments. One thing that is for certain is that the commercial pressures have tightened everywhere. And I think the ability for everybody to be competitive, whether you're in a time and material market and trying to maximise that green time opportunity that you mentioned, Paul, that's one way. But equally, we have a lot of the markets currently on OEM-led power by the hour total care packages as well. And those dynamics change because you have pricing between the airlines and the OEMs. You then have separate contracts between the OEMs and the overhaul bases. And it will be very interesting to see as the fleets mature. We may, and we'll touch on this, I think, when we talk in some of the technology questions later, we may see an acceleration away from old airframes towards newer ones driven by a sustainability agenda. And that will, again, present pressures and potentially opportunities to different players in the MRO network. My personal view, I sit very much at the front end of the life cycle, predominantly in a total care power by the hour sort of contract. That may not have an immediate impact on me, but if I was running an MRO shop competing for my own business, post transition number 1 or transition number 2 with legacy aircraft, I think there's a lot of moving parts that we're going to have to think very carefully about how we correctly position ourselves for going forward. So it's not homogenous. I think there are probably as many opportunities for people who are well capitalized and have an appetite to go and take some risk to secure maybe quite positive positions in the future. And equally, I think there'll be a few casualties along the way.
Thank you for tuning into part 1 of the Future of Aviation podcast, and join us next week for part 2, where we will discuss more around carbon neutrality, sustainability, and a hybrid aviation system. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chambers podcast. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, and why not leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google, and the other podcast platforms. For more information, please visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.